Americans from France's disadvantaged suburbs tell their own stories and take the viewers beyond the usual clichés about the French banlieue.
Sur le plan humain, c'est une expérience de fou en fait.
Les habitants valent beaucoup mieux que ce qu'on en dit.
Tu rends fier ta ville, les gens qui, quand ils me voient dans la rue, me disent « je suis fier de toi, je t'ai vu passer à la télé, c'est bien comment t'as parlé, tu nous as bien représentés ».
Watch their daily reality in the Banlieue Project on France 24 and France24.com.
Europe suffering record numbers of coronavirus cases as colder weather sets in. Curfews, travel bans, and remote schooling among the restrictions aiming to fight the spread. Calls for boycotts and protests against France. Anger across the Arab world after President Macron defends cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad. And protesters in Iraq revive a year-old movement against the government. Crowds in Baghdad were met by security forces firing water cannon and tear gas. Thanks so much for joining us here on France 24. I'm Charlie James. Europe struggling to contain a huge second wave of coronavirus infections. France reporting over 52,000 new cases in the past 24 hours, another record. Countries across the continent are introducing new restrictions in an attempt to gain control, with Spain, Italy, and Greece the latest to impose curfews. Peter O'Brien with the story.
A second wave, and with it a second nationwide state of emergency in Spain. The Spanish Prime Minister has ordered a curfew from 11 p.m. at the latest across the country and will use the state of emergency to enforce it.
Solo se podrá circular en esa franja horaria por las causas justificadas establecidas en la norma. Por ejemplo, adquirir medicamentos, cumplir las obligaciones laborales o profesionales, regresar al domicilio o cuidar a mayores o menores de edad.
Italy, meanwhile, has ordered bars and restaurants to close by 6 p.m. and has shut gyms, cinemas and swimming pools.
In tutti I territori della nostra penisola la diffusione del contagio e anche lo stress che ne consegue sul sistema sanitario nazionale hanno ormai raggiunto livelli preoccupanti.
The new measures follow protests in Naples and Rome against the introduction of curfews. On Saturday, Italy reported a record daily total of almost 20,000 infections. Over in Greece, the curfew in the Greater Athens region is one of the most lenient, starting at midnight. But in the north of the country, some areas are under full lockdown. Brussels, one of the worst-hit parts of Belgium, comes under tighter restrictions on Monday with a stricter curfew and the closure of sport and cultural facilities. Meanwhile, Berlin's curfew is already well underway, having come into force on the 10th of October. Governments across Europe are caught in a difficult balancing act as they try to stave off infections while avoiding a second lockdown, which would devastate the economy again.
France responding to calls for boycotts of French products, urging Middle East countries to stop them. French President Emmanuel Macron angered many Muslims after vowing his nation won't give up cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has now twice said Macron needs mental checks over the comments. And protests against France continue.
In the largely Arab town of Jaffa, next to Tel Aviv, 200 people turn out to protest outside the house of France's ambassador to Israel. They're carrying banners defending the Prophet Muhammad, who they say's been wronged by President Emmanuel Macron.
אנחנו ברגע הזה מוחים נגד המדיניות של הממשל הצרפתי, הממשל שקיבל פיגור גדול, הממשל הזה שפוגע במיליארד וחצי מוסלמי בעולם, הממשל הזה שמעודד פגיעה בנביאים, הממשל הזה שאין לו בכלל כבוד.
They're angry about what Macron said on Thursday during a ceremony to remember Samuel Paty. The teacher was murdered earlier this month after he'd shown cartoons of Prophet Muhammad during a lesson he was giving on free speech. The images Paty showed his students were first published by Charlie Hebdo, the satirical magazine subject to a deadly attack in 2015.
Nous ne renoncerons pas aux caricatures, aux dessins. même si d'autres reculent.
Caricatures of Muhammad are forbidden by Islam. In places like Egypt, Turkey, Algeria and Lebanon, calls for a boycott on French goods have grown on social media. In Qatar and Kuwait, several supermarket chains have removed French products from their aisles. On Saturday night in Gaza, meanwhile, some protesters set alight pictures of Macron.
Thousands of Armenians gathered here in Paris Sunday, calling on France to recognize the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region as independent. The region has been the scene of conflict between Armenian and Azerbaijani forces since the end of September. Waving French and Armenian flags side by side, the crowd demanded that Paris abandon what protesters called its stance of neutrality. Next to Belarus, where a standoff between its authoritarian leader and the opposition is reaching a head, opposition leader Svetlana Tikhanovskaya has called for a national strike to begin on Monday. She gave President Alexander Lukashenko until Sunday night to resign, but so far he shows no sign of quitting. Over 200,000 people marched through Minsk and other cities on Sunday, trying to keep up the pressure. Our correspondent Gulliver Cragg was at the protests earlier and joins us live now from Minsk. Gulliver, huge crowds today in the capital, and there were some clashes with police. What can you tell us?
Yes, the protesters really are keeping up the pressure in terms of the numbers taking part in these demonstrations. Everyone I spoke to today said that they were sure there were many more people this week than there were last week. During the afternoon, the march passed off relatively peacefully. It wasn't able to go along its planned route to the very center of Minsk, but it took another route, and when I was there I didn't see very much police presence. I'd seen a lot of police vans driving around town a little bit further away from where the main crowd was, but not along the route of the march itself. But it was then after the demonstration proper basically ended at Bangalore Square and part of the participants started to head home, which is when I left the area. Shortly after I'd left the area, I heard the first big bang, and as it turned out, as the evening went on, for about 2 hours, the police dispersed those demonstrators who were still in the area, and videos surfaced online of them chasing them down the street, firing rubber bullets at them, also using stun grenades. So far, 2 people have been reported injured. There are suspicions that there may actually be many more people who have been injured. And across the whole of Belarus, according to the Vyasna Human Rights Center, 216 people were arrested this Sunday evening. So we're used to a heavy-handed response from the Belarusian police, and it often comes towards the end of the day. It seems it was particularly heavy-handed this Sunday, also because, and this is a first, or at least it's the first time it's been reported, police broke into an apartment where a large number of protesters had taken refuge and actually tried to arrest them inside the apartment where somebody had let them come in to take shelter from the police.
Now, pushing this forward, opposition leader Tikhanovskaya has called officially for a strike to start on Monday. Who is likely to heed this call?
Well, basically people who work in the private sector are likely to heed this call, especially if they work for companies that are broadly supporting the opposition movement, or at least taking a neutral stance. A number of companies, especially cafes and places like that, have said that they will close or give their workers holidays, but that's in the private sector, and most of the Belarusian economy is state-owned, and those big state-run enterprises, the big factories, they are not giving their workers permission to strike. Far from it. Workers risk losing their revenues and their jobs if they do so, and it's thought not many really can afford to.
Gulliver Cragg in Minsk, thank you so much for your continued reporting on this story. Marking 1 year of protests, thousands took to Iraq's streets on Sunday. Mass anti-government demonstrations swept Baghdad and Iraq's south in the last year, calling for an end to rampant corruption. But little has changed, despite more than 500 people dying, many at the hands of security forces. France 24's Jack Hewson got reaction from protesters in the capital.
We're here in Tahrir Square where thousands of demonstrators have gathered both from Baghdad and from the south of the country. This is the largest number of protesters we've seen on the street for at least 6 months since COVID put a dampener both on the economy and the potential for political activism as well. The protesters have returned because essentially none of their material demands have been met in terms of services, in terms of the economy, and although there's a new Prime Minister and staff for our academy, they feel nothing significant has changed for them to stop demonstrating.
الأسباب البطالة والخدمات ومحاسبة الفاسدين بالمطالب الأولى محاسبة الفاسدين ومحاسبة قتلة المتظاهرين.
جايين هنا نطالب قتلة المتظاهرين، قتلة المتظاهرين صار سنة على قتلة المتظاهرين، لحد الآن ما شفنا أي واحد انحكم من كل السياسيين. أولاً اجتنا هاي الحكومة، حكومة الكاظم، أي شيء ما نفذ للشعب العراقي.
There are many protesters, not just at Tahrir Square, but here on the bridge. This is the Republican Bridge, which leads through to the Green Zone, which houses many of Iraq's political institutions, including the parliament.
لا نعبر اتجاه البوابة التاسعة، هي خطورة، أقول لك احنا اللي طيناه بعد ما نقدر نسكت لو ما نعرف أو ننسى أو نعرف أكو خطورة، لأن احنا ضحينا وطينا شهداء وطينا مصابين.
Moving over to South America, voting is underway in Chile for a historic referendum on whether or not to rip up the nation's constitution. Voters are deciding whether the constitution, written under the Pinochet dictatorship, should be replaced by a citizens' charter. Karis Garland looks at the stakes.
1 year after unprecedented social protests, 14 million Chileans are set to vote in a referendum this Sunday. They'll decide whether to replace the current constitution, written in 1980 under the dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet.
There are two papers. One contains a question, if you approve or reject a new constitution, and the other asks which body will write it. A mixed constitutional convention, half made up by sitting congressmen and half of elected people, or for a new fully elected constitutional convention that will also have gender parity.
The current constitution is based on a neoliberal economic model, meaning fundamental public services like education, healthcare and pensions are privatized in Chile. Over the last 30 years, Chile has had an average annual economic growth of 3.7%. Conservative parties say the constitution is to thank for the country's economic stability, and changing the text would take Chile down an unknown and dangerous road. The left-wing opposition, on the other hand, maintain the constitution is a source of inequality and prevents social reforms from being carried out. A new constitution was a key demand from those who took part in protests that erupted in October last year. Weeks later, Conservative President Sebastián Piñera agreed to the referendum. If the yes vote wins, as polls suggest, the next step will be the election of those who will form the Constitutional Convention in April.
The U.S. presidential election is now 9 days away, and the candidates are crisscrossing the country trying to reach those last undecided voters. President Donald Trump focusing attention on the must-win battleground state of Florida. But as our Washington correspondent found, some Republicans there are getting ready to vote Democratic.
Jim Farr is a lifelong Republican, and so is his wife, Joan. But after 4 years with Donald Trump in charge, they are now both considering switching sides.
He did a good job initially with the economy, moved the embassy for Israel to Jerusalem, which I think is a good decision. He's pro-life. But I'm worried about that being the only thing. I'm not sure that that one issue makes a good president all by itself.
I was hoping he would grow into a more presidential way of working, way of speaking, and he does not seem to really want to serve the people. Reluctantly, I've decided to vote for Mr. Biden.
Not presidential enough, at odds with conservative values, those are a few of the reasons some Republicans in Florida are turning their backs on Donald Trump.
The change that I see with Biden is that he's willing to work more with his opposition than Trump is. Trump goes on TV and Twitter, constantly talks bad about any opposing parties or anybody within his party that opposes him. That's not the type of person that I want to see running the country.
Back in 2016, Donald Trump won Florida by just over a point. A small shift in support could therefore change the outcome of the race in the battleground state, and given the importance of Florida, possibly the outcome of the presidential election.
That's all for this edition, but do stay with us here on France 24. More news and information coming up next.